The other thing about bullies is that once a youth is targeted as a victim, it's very hard to change the dynamic that then develops around that. That youth is singled out repeatedly, even by others, for the terrible abuse that he or she experiences. Sometimes even when the youth may decide to capitulate and behave supposedly in a more gender-typical way. About the Harvey Milk School, this is a school in New York City that has existed for a long time. It is just for LGBT youth. It is primarily, and for the longest, it has been primarily for transgendered youth. So in fact, there are a lot of LGBT youth who don't go there. They just don't go there. They stay in their local schools. To get into that school, you really have to be considered very, very gender atypical. Otherwise, you don't get placed there. And then there's the issue that I've heard from some youth when I've mentioned, the Harvey Milk School, and that is, yeah, but I won't be able to do some of the things that I really want to do, like I really kind of would like to take geometry, and I'm not sure I'm going to get it there. I mean, it does have, because it is such a small school, it has a very limited curriculum, and I think youngsters are aware of that. So although it would be good to have a school like that in any community as a last resort, I would say, there are other issues that attend having such a school, and also I worry about the marginalization. I think to pull gay kids out or transgender kids out and make a little environment for them, first of all, it is isolating them. It's marginalizing them in a way. I don't know the long-term impact that might have and how we may be preparing or not preparing them for the realities that they're going to face when they leave that school. So I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I think, nevertheless, that schools like that are things that we should think about for some of our communities, but in the process, not to see them as the panacea for everything and everything, because nothing is ever that simple.
So let me share with you two common experiences, and this sort of goes to David's issue and the phrase, "that's so gay." So I swim a lot at the university swimming pool. During the summers, there are youth groups that are brought in, and inevitably, if I'm in there when there's a group of young boys, say 8 to 11, every other phrase out of someone's mouth as people are they're getting dressed or undressed is, "oh, you're so gay," or "that's so gay." Second experience. There are times during the year where the university ROTC sends groups of people to do different kinds of water training, and sure enough, inevitably in the next row where these people are changing, the phrase "you're so gay" or "don't be gay" or whatever continues coming up. Part of what bothered me about the ad is it's as if people say "that's so gay," sort of similarly, and actually I think it's more insidious than this. I have a child who's developmentally disabled, and when people say, "oh, that's so retarded," right? And the same kind of thing, I actually think, however, that people say "that's so retarded" in a far more neutral way than they say "that's so gay." So this goes a little bit to what Ron was talking about this morning. Is this part of the socialization process of learning what it means to be a man or a boy, so that it's not simply saying, like, "that's so stupid"? I don't think that "that's so gay" said by a youth is the same thing as "that's so stupid." I think that it has to do with gay men and dissociating yourself with gay people so you establish your own masculinity. So the question in a way is this: is this inevitable? I mean, are we up against a phenomenon of the way males get their male identity is to have to create an other, a gay other, and there's no way around it? This is how you become a man in our society.
I just wanted to say that here's where gender comes in. There is a need to differentiate from the female. And somehow, over time, I don't know where it came from, maybe the historians here could speak to that, there has been an equation at least among men, for men, between being gay and being female. So to differentiate from that, anything that is female is put down, because then and only then can you be a man. And I think that's where you get the conflation, and I think we should be sensitive to that. Now, how then do we deal with that? That's something else entirely.
I absolutely agree with you that I think it's more than just saying that stupid sort of if we analyze it. But what's interesting is when you ask kids, what do you mean? When you say that, what do you mean? They inevitably say, that's stupid, that's dumb, that's all it means. And so I think when we're talking about trying to intervene and get kids to stop saying it, what we're trying to speak to them at their level, and that's why we use the sort of, that's why the content of the ad is what it is. I completely agree with you, though, that sort of from a sociocultural perspective, it's serving a greater function than to say that's so stupid. But I don't think we're going to get kids to change by sort of getting them to analyze their sort of inherent, heterosexism and misogyny, and I don't think that's going to work with the kids.
Well, and I'd like to add too that the phrase "that's so gay" has not always existed. It's a historically specific phrase, so I think it certainly can't be inevitable. These things will move on. And also I think, working with youth, a lot of it is trying to get them to think about, well, what are you saying and who else is listening and what is the impact for a lot of the language that you use and a lot of the in-language that you use. And I know we talk about in-language a lot in the youth center.
We have those data in the school climate survey that I talked about. I have not looked at those specifically, though, but that's something that I'm sure we could absolutely do. And I would suspect that these elements of school climate are not independent. Right. That schools where people are saying more of that are also schools where kids are being mistreated for other reasons.
I will only comment on the first. You asked two questions, just the first one. What I presented were actual data. It wasn't a rhetorical statement about if you divide the states into two camps, you find this or you will find this. We did find that. However, your question is important from the point of view, how do we explain that? How is it that not having a law protecting you against employment discrimination or against LGBT hate crimes, how is such a law protective? How does the opposite, not having those laws, get under your skin? And the only thing that I could think of is the realities that we have been living with the last year or two with this entire marriage issue, which I find fascinating just from an observational point of view. We've had states in the Union where gay marriage has been brought into being by the judiciary. We have then had some of those states follow up with votes by the population rescinding what the judges have decided. When the judiciary passed or proposed gay marriage, there was so much happiness by a lot of people. But I think that happiness was really connected to feeling that, oh my God, I am being treated like an equal. To then have that taken away is again to be reminded that at best you are a second citizen. I would argue that that is extremely corrosive to the self. There are prices to be paid psychologically for insults that are experienced. And I think that's what you see in that study where the states were divided into those two camps. Now, what we found also in that study was that nevertheless, in comparison to their heterosexual peers, gay people were still doing poorly. And that's because it's more than just two laws. We would need a wholesale change in the society before we could start seeing the kind of good health that I would love to see. And this reminds me of a study that I read. So I mentioned earlier I'm an associate editor. When you're an editor of a journal, you see a lot of articles. And I read this article, and I won't go into the details identifying the country, but this is a Western country, very different than ours. In this country, they have passed all kinds of laws banning anything that is anti-gay. And they have also been affirmative in the sense of demanding that gay people get treated equally in all kinds of different media in the society, in fact, mandating how much time needs to be spent on gay-related issues. Nevertheless, in this society, this country, there was a study that was recently done with, again, high school students, and they found anti-gay attitudes on the part of heterosexual youth in the schools, but also, interestingly, and unfortunately, there was anti-gay attitudes also expressed by the gay youth. So somehow or another, even when we think we could deal with and wave the magic wand and have the legal system completely change, there's still messages that are filtering through that crawl under the skin and that impact gay people and impact gay people in a negative way. And I think we need to do everything that we can with all the information that we have, all the expertise that we have at different levels of analysis in different disciplines to try, whenever possible, to change that.
So I think I want to sort of to ride on that question, maybe reformulate it. I want to ask about the pressures. So, David, your image of doing this research in the shadow of the Capitol, that's what I want to ask about, right? That, I mean, there's a real sense on this panel, although I think we saw it on the last one, that this research is being done in the shadow of a lot of political and ideological pressure, and that that's informing the research at some level, but it's there. It's not totally shut out. And I want to ask about what effect, what impact you think that might have on the research. And we take two case studies here. One is the claim that
maybe I can work backwards, and you can jump into here, and Rosalind as well, please. In terms of gender, this is a really boring answer to an interesting question, but what we do is we look to see are there differences either in the levels or in the processes, and if there are not differences, if the boys look like the girls, then we put them together. If there are differences, as in the case of HIV, where we see off the charts rates among the boys and very low rates in the girls, then we separate them. So that's a boring answer to an interesting question. This issue of causality, I think, is you're pointing out a very real limitation of any of these ecological studies. There is no way to randomize people, which would be the strongest design, to you get to move to a state with pro-social policies, and you have to stay here in Utah. And we're going to follow you over time and see what happens. There's no way to do that. So what we're left with are these sort of limited designs that are fraught for the reasons that you're pointing out. But what I would suggest is that as these studies accumulate, it's the same thing that happened with cigarette smoking. Nobody ever randomized anybody to smoking versus not smoking, and yet now everybody accepts that smoking causes cancer. And it's ridiculous because the people from the tobacco industry get up at the tables like this one, and they all say, there is no convincing data to suggest that smoking causes cancer. And actually, in some ways they're right. From a rigorous scientific perspective, they're right. But in the face of overwhelming other kinds of evidence, you sort of have to say, like, it's probably happening. We're not to the point where we have overwhelming kinds of evidence on this causal issue, but I'd like to see it accumulate to the point where we can say it as certainly as we can say that smoking causes cancer.
But I would just add one other thing. Despite that, we do have more basic research that helps us understand some of the findings that we find. Going to the tobacco, that's a perfect example. Yes, we couldn't randomize people to smoking or not smoking, but what we could do, and we did do, was we went into the lab and we exposed rats and mice to all kinds of different levels of nicotine, and we observed them what happened. And we used that as a model of what then would take place in human beings. And we tracked that. In fact, what we saw in animals was comparable to what we were seeing in adults. In humans. We also do that with stress. We submit animals to various kinds of environments and situations that we would never want to do with human beings, and then see what happens. And we've been able to trace, consequently, the negative impact of stress on the animals' physical behaviors, as well as what we would call personality or psychological well-being from my specialty.
I'd like to add, actually, that I think that it is very interesting, and I would love to see more research, I'm looking at you too, about gender variance, and especially including transgender people, because I think that, and transgender people sometimes are very difficult to study in the LGB population because they are also LGB and straight, and they have a sexual orientation as well as a gender identity, but that it is extremely important to include research about transgender youth because they are so incredibly marginalized, and we need that research to make the policy arguments, and to really have an impact on that youth population and improving their experience.
So this is such a great opportunity to talk to social scientists, which I don't really get much of a chance to do. So this is maybe a question out of one kind of disciplinary zone into another, and maybe just ask you to predict where things are headed. So this is also a question for people on this morning's panel. I mean, where are these signifiers headed? It looks like, to me, the signifier gay is moving ever earlier, right? So it's moving backwards so that younger and younger people, children, will be saying in their own heads, if not out loud, I'm gay, and signing on to that signifier. At least I'm guessing that's sort of where it's going. Now, Richie Savin-Williams' book, which I find fascinating, but I really don't know what to make of it, The New Gay Teenager. So I'm guessing maybe you know that book or you've read it inside your domain. I know Lisa will know this book very well. Seems to be suggesting that teens then are disidentifying from the word gay, considering themselves post-gay or gayish, and he goes to great lengths to sort of talk about, maybe in a kind of utopian spirit on his end, because he really wants to see it go this way, where they disassociate from the word gay. So we're going to have more and more children signing on to the signifier gay, Whereas if Richie Savin Williams is right, more and more teenagers will disidentify with the word gay, as adults still sort of see themselves as gay or queer or whatever that may be. So you're getting these kind of interesting generational warps and weaves inside these signifying fields. So on the one hand, I guess I'm interested in knowing in your own research, you're using LGB, and I kind of understand that, but in other words, is that a word that these folks are using it themselves, or they're just using it when you're asking them to use it? So I guess one question is about where you see the word gay traveling inside this domain of children to youth to adolescents to whatever. And the second question would be, this kind of goes back to where Lisa was earlier, you know, our disbelief publicly in sexual children. So do you imagine, as the word inevitably gay travels back into childhood, that gay will become much more of a desexualized signifier because of our disbelief in the sexual nature of children, or whether we will start to believe more dramatically in the sexual lives of children? I have about 49 more questions, but I'm going to leave it there to see what you say about those two questions.
Let me just try to answer the first one.
Yeah.
When I use the term LGB, I was referring to those studies. How I was using that term very loosely. The studies define sexual orientation, and they define sexual orientation in a variety of ways. They cover the gamut of what sex researchers consider sexual orientation. So we have it all the way from simply attractions, all of the cognitive stuff, attractions, your fantasies, to actual behaviors, who they're having sex with. We don't care what we're not asking you who you are, whatever, just who are you having sex with. To, how do you self-identify yourself? The studies cover all of those things, as well as there was one study, the Ad Health, that talked about relationships. So are you in a relationship? And they didn't add any sexual term to it, you know, just a relationship with a member of the same or the opposite sex. That's how it's defined. So it's not just with respect to sex, and it's not with respect to how do you see yourself. How do you yourself identify? Although, again, as I said, some have looked at that. So regardless of these definitions, all of the studies converge in terms of the findings. So whether we call it A, B, C, the findings seem to be pretty comparable to each other.
And we use what we can. I mean, Margaret's when there are these big public health data sets, and they're taxpayers pay for them, and so we try to use them. And so in one, they'll ask, like, are you attracted? And in another one, you know, and it's a single question, are you in a relationship? So we use what we can. In my own work, I think I love Rich, and I know he has created many talented students, some of whom are my colleagues, but most kids say that they're gay.
Yeah,
you know,
I had a very hard time making sense of that book, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, and that's not to say that there aren't kids. I mean, we get Jordan and I, who have been trying to, a graduate student here who's been working with my data with me. We're like, there are these kids who identify as other things, who are sort of making political statements with their identities. We've got one kid who identified as Aiden as their sexual orientation, and I was, because we let them say, "What are you? You know, what are you?" And so, you know, rarely we get kids who make these very political statements with their identities, but most of them say I'm gay or I'm lesbian, or then you know, and then some of them are like, well, I'm a butch queen, or I'm a, you know, they take on these other identities, but that are clearly queer identities of some sort. And so I think it is happening, but I don't know that it's.
Yeah.
I think there's much less identification with the gay community. So I think it's separate from the labeling issue.
Right.
I think psychologically the kids are actually sort of distancing themselves because they don't feel the need to be as affiliated because it's easier.
Right.
You know, despite the data that we're presenting, there are also a lot of kids, you know, for every, you know, I say 1/3 of the kids have been beaten with a stick or something like that. Well, 2/3 of the kids have not been beaten with a stick. And so those are the kids who actually feel like, you know, I don't need to own this sort of community because I'm okay hanging out with my friends.
I guess I'm wondering, too, I mean, just sort of asking you to speculate or even, you know, like speak outside of your data sets, just as people in contact with so many LGB youth, in this sense, that in other words, there's harm inside the word gay itself. That's sort of the complication, right? I mean, obviously, according to the ad, you're already confessing that. But I mean in a different sense, that in the sort of Butlerian sense, that inside gay is a consolidation of a congealed identity with clinical concerns defined by the larger culture outside, not defined by you. You don't get to choose necessarily what that word means. You don't even get to choose. I can say I'm not gay, but I have to be granted that detachment by a community of people. I can't detach myself from gay unless a community of people say I can disengage from the word gay. So I'm wondering whether you, just as researchers, I'm just confessing my own qualms. I don't know if this is good or bad that the word gay is sliding back into childhood, and I don't know whether to affirm that or be scared of that. I mean, the kinds of things that many of us grew up sort of metaphorizing ourselves as vampires or dogs or whatever, just to understand what we were, as we did or did not identify with the word. The word is not neutral. It has like all kinds of signifieds attached to them, some of them clinical, some of them cultural, some of them political, and that word is sliding back into childhood, and we haven't really had yet that conversation. I have no answer to this, and I don't even have a consolidated sense yet myself of what I think, but something fascinating is going on in the rollback of the signifier. And then our divided sense probably in this room, on the one hand affirming if somebody wants to call themselves gay at age 6, I'm not going to tell them not to, but it's not like that's without consequences either in terms of the attachment to that word and all that sticks to it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, at a more concrete level than I'm sure you want me to be, but what we see is that when kids are, as these kids take on the identity younger, it brings with it the victimization. So, I think there's a sort of this double-edged sword. If you don't take on the identity, you suffer the consequences of living, of hiding and living in the closet.
Exactly.
But you're also spared the consequences of relentless bullying and rejection from your families.
Right.
And so I think it's interesting to think about. There's going to be I think there's going to be a new wave of syndemic among this generation of youth, many of whom are identifying much younger.
Right.
Earlier, 10 years ago when we would look at these studies, the kids who came out younger fared far worse. And so, again, that suggests that as this signifier moves back, it's not going to
But even
bode
10
well
years ago, in other words, we didn't have a culture with any public discourse on gay children in the present tense. I'm really struck by our conversations today that most of the conversations are about kids who are gay now. It used to be that you only become gay retrospectively. When I come out at 23, now I have a discourse about having been a gay child when I'm no longer a child. That's a very different kind of discourse than having a discourse on gay childhood while you are, being a so-called child.
Absolutely. Ron might have had an answer or something to add to this conversation. You stood up, I noticed. And
well, you just said it. I mean, in our analyses of European men's health study, we found this fascinating phenomena of when men come out. And we were able to create, it turns out the data create 3 clusters. There's this group of kids who came out like they knew they were sexually attracted to other boys by the 2nd grade. By the 6th grade, they had already had sex with another boy. They decided that they were gay very, very early, and they told somebody else they were gay by the time they were in the 9th grade. And then there was a middling group of guys who kind of, by the time they were sophomores in college, they told somebody that they were gay. And there's this other group, which I just can't understand, waited until they were 30 before they told another human being that they were gay. Well, sure enough, and the reason, and this is Mark Friedman's analysis, the reason that Mark did this was, his hypothesis is that the kids who came out early would fare far worse in terms of violence victimization as teenagers, and that he would also have far worse health profiles as adults. And indeed, both of those things are true in the Urban Men's Health Study data set. And I think your question about the realization that that some proportion, some small group of every single classroom are going to be sexual minorities is dawning on everybody. And so parents are being a lot more vigilant. Everybody's aware that this is going to happen. And so one would predict that the violence victimization and the lack of protection would go up. Kids can't hide as well anymore. It's in the tube. Which is why things like creating the gay-straight alliances and helping parents deal with having kids that are different in healthier ways for those kids is so crucial in terms of making sure we protect the next generation. And we can do that work. And Dave, I think another way to go besides randomizing people to political environments, another way to go would be to randomize the schools and see if we can do structural interventions where you randomize 2 groups of schools where you do the structural intervention of helping protect all kids from this kind of violence victimization. I think the group of kids who are going to benefit the most are going to be the heterosexual girls. So the straight boys are desperately trying to prove their heterosexual bona fides. What's the most direct way that you can do that? Have sex with a girl, right? Well, but and so what is the first thing that most teenage boys do the minute they finally manage to have sex with a girl? Tell everyone in the school. If you want to keep having, and everybody blames on the hormones, but if you want to keep having sex with that girl, the worst thing that you can do is blab your mouth all over the school, right? So what are they? Who are they really interested in, and what is the audience that they're really crucially, desperately trying to affect? It's other straight boys. And then why are they doing that? Because they're terrified of getting beaten up. So there's this whole group of girls who have to walk a tightrope between being either a nun, this is language from California high schools. You can either be a nun or a hoe. And the line between being a nun and a hoe is about this big, and these girls are walking these lines for years of their lives while they're trying to get through high school and get an education. How kids manage to read by the time they get out of school is beyond me. And not be objects of violent victimization. And so if we make schools safe for our kids, a lot of good things will happen. And probably the smallest group of people that will benefit will be queer kids.
Yes.
Okay, this is for Dave and Rose Ellen, kind of. Dave, you were talking about how there is not a lot of the study of the mechanisms that is causing this violence, and it made me think of my undergrad research that I'm working on right now of the way that the media influences what is going on. And there's this article, there's this thing out, I don't know who the author was, I don't know authors, but the title of it was, "We're Here, We're Queer, and We're on TV." And the study looked at the way that films change the way that people view lesbians and gays and transgenders. And so they had this group from the University of Illinois that watched 3 different movies. One of them was straight rights, and then another one was about the parents dealing with homophobia, and then another one was about domestic violence. And then they gave these participants a survey 10 to 14 days later, and they asked them to rate different questions, and they looked at their homophobia, and it showed how the different movies affected it. And so I was wondering from you all to wonder how the media influences what is going on, and if that shapes this bullying and this victimization, because it's really clear that there's a problem going on in school and that there's a problem, but nobody ever really touches on where the problem stems from or where these kids get this internalization that gay is going to be bad. And so I was wondering if you feel that it's from the media and if that could be changed.
Well, one thing that I'm thinking about is, and again, I don't work as much with kids in schools, mostly because we're not really able to in Utah, but I know that the youth that I work with love watching LGBT role models. You know, we've watched the Ellen video so many times in the tent because it's really important to them to see those positive role models. And I think, you know, this is almost the first generation where there are a number of positive queer role models in the media for them to look up to. So I know that that has a big impact on positive self-esteem.
I don't think I have a satisfactory answer. I mean, I think absolutely the media contributes to the representations of gay, as Catherine has discussed, I think absolutely contribute to, you know, and the increased number, the frequency with which they're available and accessible have contributed to, both in positive and in negative ways, to the response to that identity. You know, I think, you know, kids have something that they can look to. If you're gay, you don't feel quite as alone. And at the same time, if you're straight, you have someone that you know that you can sort of, you have a new word to call somebody, you know.
Yeah, Lisa.
Let's go slightly back to the whole gay issue, and it's something that I think it's a good time to bring it up because we have inadvertently kind of collectively gone toward a space in which we've created the, you know, gay and lesbian teens, and we say the B, But we haven't really been talking about kids that have patterns of attraction and behavior to both sexes. And I think that has something to do with, I mean, in terms of like those kids as they exist, and the adults as well, has a lot to do with what's happening to the signifier of gay, because a lot of the kids who say, well, I don't really identify with the community, are kids who are actively engaging in sex with both genders and who are a little bit distanced from the gay or lesbian term because they know that traditionally that term excludes bisexual patterns of attraction and behavior. They may not want to identify as bisexual because that has its own issue. They would be like, well, I'm not really 50-50. I'm like an 80-20, so I'm not really a lesbian. I'm not really, whatever. And I think that's a part of what's going on is there's more visibility of that. And I think the sort of missing discourse on that population is really important because a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the gender deviance of these queer kids, a lot of the implicit discussion is their visibility, the degree to which they're subject to victimization because we can find them, because we can see them, because they carry on their body markers that make it easy for the other kids to say, oh my God, that's a totally queer kid that I want to beat up. And one of the things that makes development for these kids with bisexual patterns of attraction and behavior more complicated is that they can hide. They can hide a lot easier. Ron, I don't remember when we talked about the boy having sex with girls, well, some of the boys want to have sex with girls, and it's really convenient to do that as a way to avoid violence and victimization. And I think the reason that this bears discussion is that for a long time, I think in the social science literature, we just assumed that the bi kids weren't as much, didn't have as much risk facing them as gay and lesbian kids. And I recently did a review of this literature with one of my graduate students because there were finally enough studies that actually asked about bisexual patterns of attraction and behavior. And first of all, we now know from every single representative study that's been done that the number of kids and adults with bisexual patterns of attraction and or behavior is way, way higher than those with exclusive patterns of attraction and behavior. And again, I say attractions or behavior. We don't know what the motives, and there's a whole range of things that can fall into that category. But obviously there's a lot of folks who don't neatly fit into the category of gay. Second, the studies that have looked at their adjustment show that they are worse off. They're consistently worse off, especially in adolescence. And again, there's a number of reasons that could be. Were they worse off to begin with, and the ones that are more worse off are the ones who are going to pursue sex with the opposite sex in order to better hide that they're exclusively attracted to the same sex? That's one pathway. Another potential pathway is that these are kids who legitimately are attracted to both sexes. They look at society, they see a model that says, wow, I can either be gay and identify as gay and have that source of support, even though I know that I'm actually bi, and that gay people hate bisexuals and they won't want to have sex with me because they think I'm bi, and I'm clearly not heterosexual, so that's not my community either. I have more potential for confusion, blah, 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 blah. So what I'm saying is that we've allowed the discussion to sort of use gay and lesbian, and we throw out the B, but it really does throw a wrench into things. And I want us to make sure not to let that drop out of the discussion, because I think that there's more awareness of that now, and certainly I think kids are more aware of the possibility of being somehow in a middle ground. And I don't think we really know yet what's a good model for that. I think for many years, I think clinicians felt like that the right message to tell kids was, well, let's help you accept your identity. And now I think a lot of clinicians are saying, well, maybe we should say to kids, you know what, we don't really know where you're going to end up on the spectrum, and maybe it's okay to not really know. And that sounds really good on one hand. On the other hand, if you're like a confused gay teen, having like adults say, wow, like we have no idea what to tell you, it's a crapshoot, might not be that affirming either. And so I have no answers. I just want to make sure that we don't lose that aspect of it.
I think that's a great point. Is Jordan Rollo here still? Did she take off? A graduate student in our department who's been doing a lot of work with bisexuality, and she's been looking at these data and the kids specifically in my study. And one of the things that we're finding is that, so we look at, does identity predict or does their behavior predict, and what combinations of those things predict? And interestingly, identity predicts the likelihood that you're going to be victimized. So if you identify as gay, you're more likely to be victimized than if you identify as bi, independent of who you're having sex with. That's the only thing that identity predicts. after that, all of the action is in your behavior. Now, we don't have attractions, unfortunately. I wish we did. But when we look at attractions, or when we look at behaviors, the kids who are abstinent are, like we see in heterosexual populations, they're the most depressed. They have the lowest self-esteem because they're not getting any, maybe. I don't know what the findings about. But we see that across the board in straight studies too, or they're just socially awkward. The bisexual kids have the highest rates, again, not bisexually identified, but bisexually behaving, have the highest rates of substance use, of all sorts of other risk behaviors, which is really interesting. Again, it doesn't matter whether they're calling themselves gay or straight or whatever. It's when their behavior is mixing it up, that's when they start to engage in these risk behaviors, and then the gay behaving kids are safer.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Oh, we got two more questions. Go ahead. Let's.
I'm just wondering, since I'm a political activist and I don't hear of this research, you guys do amazing research. Do you do anything proactive with your research so that people like me, because I've been taking on the school board now for a while and trying to get sexual orientation and gender identity in the discrimination policy, and that the superintendent got a legal opinion about 3 years ago, and the lawyer said, don't do it, you'll expose yourself to more lawsuits. And now, because of HRC and a lot of the research they've done, they've actually gone out and said, okay, let's go look at all the school districts that have adopted these policies and see how many times they've been sued. And I also think there's some research about whether or not it's reduced the number of hate crimes and bullying. But from my experience in dealing with the school board, the board is of the opinion that if they adopt a policy that includes a non-discrimination policy that includes sexual orientation, the teachers are going to stop some of that bullying and be more aware and proactive about it.
I mean, that's what we think happens, absolutely. And I try to do much of my research in collaboration with community organizations so we just collected data from 1,000 gay and bisexual men in Utah with the health department, with the Utah AIDS Foundation, with the Pride Center as partners. And so what we do is whenever we collect these data, I have to publish them, otherwise they're not going to let me keep my job. But then we also, before we publish them, we try to sort of disseminate them and analyze them in a way that's going to be most useful to these community partners. And so, for example, the health department right now has our data, and they're looking at them for their own purposes, and then we're going to work together to try to figure out, okay, what does this mean for programs here in Utah? So we try to do as much of that as we possibly can. I'll speak for myself. I try to do as much of that as I possibly can. I think most of us who work in this field.
I'm glad I came to this day because we've talked several times and over the past couple months, and I had no idea you were doing this. And I want you to go give that presentation to the school board. If you're willing.
I'm there.
Because they don't know. They have no idea. I mean, they're really naive.
Mm-hmm. And as a follow-up question to you, Dave, what are you doing to make the community that were participants in the study aware of the results of the study? Because I think a lot of people would be very interested to know how that turned out.
Well, with the 1,000 men that I just talked about here in Utah, we're going to issue a press release hopefully in the next month. There's so much data and it takes so much time to look at, but we're specifically Utah right now is in the was in the middle of debating whether or not we should provide employment protections to gay and lesbian folks. So we have questions about that specifically, and so we're going to issue a press release with the findings of those specific questions. So we always try to do something to feed it back to as many people as possible.
Okay, Lisa, last question.
So, like, do you feel like your friends like you more, or do you have more friends, or do you have?
How many students at this school are your friends, or can you talk to? What is the feeling of acceptance? So on one hand, an ally can help police other students' behavior, but just the presence of being an ally has been shown to reduce distress through other mechanisms.
Yeah, so this is the dilemma with these big public health data sets, is that they're like 10 questions in them, and we sort of try to squeeze whatever we possibly can out of these 10 questions. So there is one question in that data set that says, has a teacher intervened on your behalf? And we find that kids in the schools with the Gay Straight Alliances, they're more likely to have teachers intervene on their behalf. We don't have anything about their peers. Have your peers intervene? But I think that would be a fantastic question to ask. And if we were doing sort of a more psychological and less epidemiologic study, we could absolutely have the room to do that kind of stuff. And I think it would be fantastic to see.
Given that we know from all the social support literature that perceiving that support is available is actually associated with far better outcomes than actually receiving. You can imagine that that could be something that a GSA could do.
And that's what we see. Yeah.
Expectation that it's like, you know what, if I needed someone to stand up for me, luckily I won't have to find out if that person is there for me, but I believe that I could get that support.
Yeah, even among the kids that don't participate in their GSAs, just having one there affects their well-being.
Well, to keep us from going too far over, it's wonderful when you're on a panel like this when the problem is you're running out of time, not running out of questions. We're obviously not going to run out of questions before we have run out of time. Thank you all for attending. Please join me in thanking the panel. And let me remind you, 8:30 tomorrow morning, we start again. We've got 2 other wonderful panels, and we hope we get to see you then. Thanks again.